So Rahner was born in 1904 to a large Catholic family, lower middle class in Bavaria. And at 18, so straight out of the gymnasium, straight out of secondary school, he joined the Jesuits, where he went through the long education that Jesuits undergo before he became in philosophy and theology, before he became a priest. It was then decided that he should specialize in the history of philosophy, so he was sent to do a PhD in philosophy. And he worked on Thomas Aquinas, but at the same time he went to the seminars of Martin Heidegger, a major philosopher who's been very, very influential in the 20th century, often considered an existentialist philosopher. The PhD was on Aquinas, and he didn't do just a very standard interpretation of Aquinas, but he tried to work out a lot of his own ideas and engage with quite a bit of modern thought in the PhD. And quite an interesting thing is that he actually failed the PhD. His supervisor, I presume, was a much more conservative Thomist than he was. His order then independently thought that he should be a theologian and not a philosopher, and he went off and very quickly did, in 1 year, a PhD in theology. But the failed PhD was then published as Spirit in the World, which is considered his most major philosophical work. The Catholic Church into which Rahner was born and into which he trained for the priesthood was one that had reacted quite strongly against modernity, starting sometime in the late 19th century and especially after something called the modernist crisis in the early 20th century. There was a real rigidity to the way philosophy and theology were done. There was a single kind of philosophy and theology done in any seminaries across the world. It's usually called Neoscholasticism. It thought that it was simply doing what Thomas Aquinas did, although most modern scholars now think it's not actually that close to Aquinas. It's very much shaped by various subsequent things, but it's kind of very rationalistic, quite dry, and quite authoritarian way of studying theology and philosophy. And this is what Rahner would have been trained into in his basic philosophical and theological studies for his training as a Jesuit. Now, obviously, when he sort of went along to Heidegger's seminar, he'd have been exposed to something else. Heidegger is probably the most important philosopher, certainly in the continental tradition in the 20th century, often classed as an existentialist philosopher. And so Heidegger would have been another influence, but also while Rahner was a student, he read quite widely outside of his studies, and he read a series of books by a Belgian Jesuit called Joseph Maréchal. And Maréchal had started the process of trying to say for these Catholic thinkers that we don't need to simply be scared of the modern world, and we don't need to simply be scared of modern philosophy. So the Neoscholastics thought it was all a big mistake, and you simply needed to refute it and go back to the truth as was known in the 13th century. I think of Rahner as being educated into this quite stagnant and calcified system, and his life project in a way was to open it up and to show that actually not just with philosophy but in lots of ways one could look more positively to the world outside. One could recognize problems that you had inside. You could address problems without betraying the basic commitments of Catholic theology. So he's a thinker who very much holds together a deep loyalty to the Church, to the Catholic Church in particular, to its basic sense of the rules you have to follow, and a deep, profound, innovative ability that you can do things differently, that you don't have to be caught in the old traps. So one of the features of this Neoscholastic thought, which was so dominant when Rahner was educated, was a kind of sharp separation between the natural and the supernatural, between nature and grace, between the world as we experienced it and know it in everyday life, and then what God is doing in infusing grace into our soul. So it led to a kind of, this may be a bit of a caricature, but a bit of a schizophrenic existence, where you believed as a matter of faith that when you went to Mass or when you received the sacrament of confession, that something was going on in your soul, but it was completely beyond your experience. And this was something that gave a whole sort of style to this kind of Catholicism. And this is something that Rahner, together with Henri de Lubac, who was a major sort of historical theologian. They both questions the kind of absolute separation between nature and grace that had been going on in the Catholic Church at the time. And in Rahner's case, what he said was that he had a big emphasis on grace being not something that was extrinsic to us, not completely apart from our experience, but it must actually shape us. We can't suppose that our whole relationship with God and what Christ does, everything that comes, we can't suppose that this goes on behind our back. It must be there in our experience. And it must be not only in the experience of, you know, very explicitly religious things, going to Mass, saying prayers, but it must actually suffuse our experience. As I've done, one tends to talk about Rahner by first talking about his philosophical works and through Marischal, his engagement with Heidegger, and then through Marischal, his engagement with Kant. And sometimes Rahner gets caricatured as a theologian who's driven by his response and retrieval of modern theology from Kant onwards, and then people tend to think this shapes everything which comes after. He lays a philosophical foundation and then he builds his theology on top of it. That's a very common way in which Rahner is read, and I don't think it's actually fair to Rahner. Now, one reason why there's a number of reasons why people tend to see him this way. Obviously, what you do first, and your big books look philosophical, so it's easy to do that. And some people have thought it would be wonderful to have a philosophical foundation. This is the way Catholicism has usually worked in the modern period, that you first lay a philosophical foundation, so they've expected it. But another reason that people tend to fall into what I think is a trap of seeing his theology as just being determined and based on his philosophy is because there is one central idea that he develops in his philosophy. I mean, there's probably more than one, but there's really one absolutely critical idea that he develops in his philosophy that he then does come back to again and again in his theology. But I think you should say that that doesn't actually mean the whole theology is resting on the philosophy. But there's this one idea which is, if there is a center to Rahner's thought, then this is certainly very near it. And this is the idea in German, his notion of a Vorgriff auf Esse, which we would translate into English as something like a pre-apprehension of being, or a reaching out towards being. And ultimately, Rahner thinks of reaching out towards God. This is a very distinctive aspect of Rahner's thought, and it's a slightly tricky one, but I think quite interesting. The notion that to be human is always to be reaching out towards God in all our experiencing, in all our knowing, and in all our choosing. At every point, as we know and choose very particular things, at the same time, we're always transcending those things and moving towards God. It's a very radical claim. That the religious aspect of our experience doesn't come here and there at moments of ecstatic prayer or something, but is always there and very woven into the very texture of our experience. And according to Rahner, if we didn't have this Vorgriff, this transcendence towards God, we wouldn't be human at all. We'd be incapable of being conscious in a human way. It's quite a hard idea to get a hold of, and I sometimes think that some images are the easiest way to do it. So things I've used in my book or in lectures sometimes will be a series of images. Some of them Rahner uses himself. So for instance, that infinite being or God for Rahner is like the horizon within which we move, and within which whatever we see it within the horizon. You can never pin the horizon down. You can never grab it, but you can never see a tree or a mountain without simultaneously being aware of the horizon. So for Rahner, we can't know or think about God properly as one object amongst others. It's not something that I can grab hold of like this chair that I'm sitting on. But I can't think about anything else except against this horizon of